Okay, hi everybody on the line. Thank you so much for joining today's session, which focuses on assessing migrant worker communities for modern slavery risk. So this is a Mekong Club run webinar. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with the Mekong Club, we are a non-profit that is headquartered in Hong Kong that focuses on addressing modern slavery through private sector engagement. So we have a membership model, and I can see a number of our members on the line today. Companies can join the Mekong Club to gain access to working groups discussing modern slavery issues, a range of tools and resources, our network of like-minded private sector professionals all working to address modern slavery, as well as one-on-one consultancy and support. Now, responsible recruitment, of course, is a key topic of conversation amongst our membership, particularly relating to migrant workers, as these workers often face many challenges and risks as they journey to find work within the global supply chains, from irresponsible recruitment fees and excessive recruitment fees to issues with employment contracts to deception from recruitment agencies and employers along the way. So today is a really great opportunity to hear from experts who are working on the ground in Vietnam, to ask questions and to dig a little bit deeper into this topic. As part of our work at the Mekong Club, we organize sessions like today to educate our membership and our wider community on key issues, and also to highlight the great work that our partners are doing in this space. So today we are fortunate to be joined by two great speakers. If you guys don't mind making sure your lines are on mute, please, just getting a bit of feedback, thanks. So today we're fortunate to be joined by two wonderful speakers. So John is the Business Operations Manager for Matera Alliance, which specializes in workforce development solutions. So in his role, he manages the implementation of FACT, which is the Factory Awareness to Counter Trafficking training, to raise awareness of human trafficking and forced labor in global supply chains across Vietnam. And Christina serves as the Capacity Building for Responders Program Manager for Pacific Links Foundation. Christina's counter-trafficking work includes building the capacity of European frontline responders in supporting vulnerable Vietnamese migrants and victims of trafficking, working with disadvantaged communities and forging partnerships across sectors. So today, John and Christina will each present before we break for Q&A with the speakers. So if you have any questions that come to mind while they're speaking, feel free to pop them into the chat box on Zoom, either publicly, or feel free to message me privately with your question. I will make sure we get through all of the questions at the end. Just so you're aware, this webinar is being recorded and we will be sending out the recording after the session. You'll be free to share that with your colleagues for their information too. So without further ado, Christina, if you'd like to share your screen, and I'll pass over to you to kick off. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Phoebe, and thank you to the Mekong Club for inviting Pacific Links to speak today. Again, my name is Christina Bui, and I am I'm the CARES Program Deputy Director for Pacific Links Foundation. So today, I'll be speaking to you about the labor migration trends and patterns from Vietnam, and John will then go deeper into the Vietnam context. Just to give a brief overview of what I'll be speaking about. Again, I'll be giving an overview on the profile of Vietnam labor migration, or as in Vietnamese, we say Vietnam labor export. I'll also discuss contract-based migration versus irregular migration. I'll talk about the profile of Vietnamese migrants, the impact of COVID-19 on Vietnam, Law 69 in Vietnam, and the kind of protections that are offered to migrant workers under the law. And I'll dive into a couple of case studies and wrap up with the work that Pacific Links has been doing to support Vietnamese migrants. So in Vietnam, there is a deep history of a lot of Vietnamese folks migrating abroad to work. So the term that the Vietnamese government uses, translated into English, is called labor export. Again, migration abroad for employment. So labor export is promoted by the government to create jobs, to reduce unemployment and poverty in a lot of areas, particularly in the rural areas in Vietnam, to increase incomes for the poor and to contribute to the social economic development of Vietnam. Currently, there are over 500,000 contract workers who are working abroad under contract-based employment. So you can see on the screen, there are a couple of statistics. This year, the government expects to send 90,000 workers abroad. And last year, due to COVID, they were only able to send 45,000 workers, 33% of whom were women. The previous year during COVID, they were still able to send 76,000. And at the height in 2019, before COVID, Vietnam has been able to send about 152,000 workers throughout 40 different countries in the world, and 36% of whom are women. So the biggest markets that Vietnamese workers are sent to or work in include South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. So these three countries make up 95% of Vietnamese labor export. And other countries may include Saudi Arabia, Romania, Hungary, etc. And some of the industries that Vietnamese migrant workers work in include manufacturing, construction, hospitality, domestic work, etc. So oftentimes they're sent to the higher income countries to do work that citizens of that country are not able or not willing to do. And as I mentioned, this really contributes to the social economic development of Vietnam. We can see here that last year, over 18 billion US dollars were sent back to Vietnam in the form of remittances, which contributes to 5% of Vietnam's GDP. And of that 18 billion, 2 to 2.5 billion US dollars come from these contract workers, which is an average increase of about 6 to 7% per year between 2010 to 2017. And of course, this number does not include those that are sent through other means, through more informal means, such as money laundering, for example. So there is difference between contract-based versus irregular migration. So contract-based migration is promoted by the government, and there are usually specific requirements for employing contract workers. So it may be due to age or the physical location of the workers, like whether they're in such and such province in Vietnam, the specific skill sets that they possess. And recruitment is normally done via postings on the websites of the Ministry of Labor and Balance of Social Affairs, or MOLISA, or its sub-departments, which is DOLAB, the Department of Overseas Labor. And usually they could also work with authorized recruitment agencies within Vietnam to help them recruit for the job postings. They could also work with agencies that are located overseas in the specific target countries. So these agencies are authorized by the Vietnamese government, and they have the proper licenses to recruit for that particular factory in that country or for the particular country itself. So it really depends. And so the labor or work contracts are signed with the employer, so usually with the factory or with the company. Proper work visas are then provided in order for the contract-based worker to legally migrate to that country. And they are entitled to protections under the law, and in particular under Vietnam's Law 69, which I will get into later. But it is important to note that contract-based migration could turn into irregular migration. So on the irregular migration side, it is normally done through smuggling or human trafficking. So they could contact unscrupulous labor brokers, for example, or smugglers to say, hey, I want to go to such and such country because I hear I could make a lot of money. And normally the fees that they have to pay are a lot higher compared to the contract-based migration fees. Irregular migration could be an instance where it is legal movement, as in the migrant had come to the country on a tourist or work visa, which then turns into illegal migration. So they overstay their visa instead of returning when the visa expires. Those who migrate through irregular means are more susceptible to human trafficking or forced labor. They are exposed to a lot more vulnerabilities, which I'll get to in the next slide. And protection for those who undergo irregular migration may vary from country to country, and they are not completely protected under the law. And in some instances, depending on the work that they do or how they are, if they are arrested and whatnot, they may be charged with committing a crime as well. And just also to note, there tends to be an uneven distribution of men versus women who migrate, but it also depends on the country and the type of work that they do. So for example, there are many more women who migrate to Saudi Arabia to work as domestic workers. And these contract-based migrant workers are really key to a lot of migration, key to a lot of industries in different countries. So in Romania, there was a newspaper article that came out a couple weeks ago that stated that about 10% of its citizens go elsewhere because Romania is located within Europe. So they need migrant workers to fill in the jobs that Romanian citizens are not able to. And with recruitment agencies in particular, there may be different layers to that as well. So the recruitment agencies could be based in Vietnam and could recruit in Vietnam for a different recruitment agency that is based outside of Vietnam, that is then recruiting for an overseas factory. So it may be one layer of recruitment agencies, there may be two, or there may be even three. And I'll talk about that when we get to the Serbia case study. With regards to Vietnamese migrants, they tend to be young men and women, generally between the ages of 18 to 35 years old. This also depends on the particular employer and what they are looking for. Sometimes, if they're construction-based employer, for example, they may be seeking young men who have the necessary skill sets to do the hard labor. They also tend to come from rural and more impoverished areas, and many of them do come from localities with a history of immigration to other countries or to other areas within Vietnam. There is a perceived lack of opportunities in their hometowns. When we speak to these kinds of migrants, they often say, oh, there's nothing for me to do in my hometown. I don't see a future for me here. And oftentimes they look around and they see that there are other people in their hometowns who are leaving. And so they think that their future lies elsewhere. And of course, there are particular push and pull factors that encourage migrants to leave Vietnam or to leave their locality and seek employment elsewhere. Cultural factors include the need for to make money for the family, to provide for the family. There's a deep culture, or there's a deep tradition in Vietnam of children being expected to care for their parents when they're older and to help provide for the family. When a family member incurs debt, oftentimes it falls on the children or everyone in the family to kind of help pull the family out of debt. There are economic factors as well, some of which do include environmental factors. So in Hà Tĩnh, for example, in 2016, there was a toxic waste spill that had happened. And in that year and in the years after, we saw an increase in the number of migrants immigrating from Hà Tĩnh and the surrounding areas like Nghệ An and Quang Binh in north central Vietnam. And of course, there are also social political factors as well. Some of the migrants that we have met abroad, like in Europe, have said that they are fleeing political persecution or religious persecution. And in some of the cases, it may be apparent. There are a lot of risks and vulnerabilities, both for contract-based migrants and irregular migrants, but more so for irregular migrants because they are living in a life in the shadows, so to speak. So many of them are susceptible to false advertisements by unscrupulous recruitment agencies, especially for those who aren't aware of the laws that are in place to protect them or the kind of requirements that are needed for those particular job postings. So for example, I saw a job listing for South Korea saying that they're only recruiting workers from 8 particular provinces. And there are recruitment agencies that are advertising that they would be able to help switch the person's address, or what we call family registry, the HOKO, to a province that is accepted for recruitment. And this is illegal. And this also ties in with their lack of understanding of the laws and regulations. So I'll speak to this in a second, but Law 69 was adopted in 2020 and enacted in February of this year. So a lot of migrants may not be aware of the laws in place that are there to protect them, but also to prevent recruitment agencies that have their licenses revoked from recruiting for fake job positions or false job positions. They may be at risk of paying excessive broker's fee, and which would then turn into debt bondage, especially for those migrants who are smuggled abroad. And we have heard a range of amount of money that migrants have been expected to pay in order to pay for broker's fees, smuggling fees, fees for visas, for the recruitment agencies to help get visas, for example. And when they're in debt bondage, they may feel obligated to put themselves through a lot of unsavory, I guess, situations, like having to do a job that they really don't want to do, or that puts their lives at risk. And with debt bondage as well, their family may be at risk of being threatened by the smugglers or the traffickers. There's always that risk of exploitation. Exploitation meaning labor exploitation or sexual exploitation, either en route to the country, especially for irregular migrants, or while they are in that destination country. And of course, all of this can add up to control by the traffickers. So if there's an excessive amount of debt that they're unable to pay, the traffickers may be able to force them to do things that they may not want to do. When COVID-19 was declared a pandemic in March 2020, most countries around the world had closed their borders, including Vietnam. So this had then caused 2 scenarios. The first is that migrant workers who are already abroad, both those who are contract-based and those who are undocumented, were stuck in their current countries and could not go back to Vietnam or move around to other countries. And the second scenario is those who wanted to migrate abroad for work could not do so. This, in addition to the limited international flights, the restrictions of movement meant that people were kind of stuck where they are. And this would particularly put them at risk if they were in debt. And so COVID-19 has really exacerbated existing vulnerabilities. So, so for those who we worked with in Europe, for example, the irregular migrants remained stuck in Europe, and some of them were already living in such precarious conditions. So they likely did not have access to healthcare or mental health support, for example, 2 things that were very necessary to stay safe during COVID and during the lockdowns. And for Vietnam in particular, there weren't heavy lockdowns until June of last year, until May or June of last year. So when Vietnam started implementing heavier and more restricted lockdowns, this had created labor supply shortages because those who had heard of the lockdowns knew that they would not be able to work. So then a lot of them left to go back to their hometowns. And when lockdowns were lifted in October 2021, many of them decided to just remain in their hometowns and not return to work or not go back to the industrial zones. So this then created a labor supply shortages for many factories and industrial areas. This also caused a growth in labor brokers as well, because they know that there are many migrants who were fed up with their low wages, for example, or their living situation in the city. And it then became an opportunity for these smugglers and traffickers to lure the victims via job introductions, saying that there's a job in China, for example, or a job in Thailand or Cambodia that would pay a lot more than the factory jobs that they were working before. with everyone kind of staying put, like sheltering in place at home and unable to work, this also caused an increase in social media use because there's nothing else to do. And there are already a lot of smugglers and traffickers advertising online, particularly on social media, like Facebook and the Vietnam-based social media app called Zalo. And so this made it more migrants more vulnerable to falling for the kinds of false advertisements that the smugglers would place on social media. And for those who were already in the various destination countries, vaccination was also used as a way to control the migrants' movements in 2021. So in Serbia, for example, many workers who had fallen into the situation of poor living conditions and forced labor, they had wanted to return to Vietnam, but because they weren't vaccinated and due to the exorbitant fees at that time, they could not go back to Vietnam. So, and they had tried to request to be vaccinated in Serbia. They were rebuffed by their factories, by the employers. So again, that was another way to control migrants' movements in 2021 when vaccination was not as widespread. And also during COVID, there was, in addition to not wanting to go back to the factories to work, there were many people who were moving around to other places. And a lot of workers now, like people may still not have jobs, or they were waiting to international flights to resume, which happened earlier this year. And there are people who are willing to pay higher prices so that they would be able to take a quote unquote safer route to get to the country that they want to. And the smugglers would then advertise these safer routes so they would be able to make more money off of irregular migrants in particular. On the screen, you can see that these are some of the advertisements that we have screen captured from Facebook. The translation of the aquamarine one, the turquoise one, says Serbia to Romania to Germany with a price of 6,500. If you want to go, just contact me this week and I'll pick you up. And they make it sound as simple as that. And for us, we've been doing this work particularly with regards to irregular migration to Europe for a couple of years now. We know that normally people are willing to pay 20 to 40,000 US dollars to go to Germany, to UK, to Poland in Europe. So the fact that this is only 6,500 makes it a lot cheaper for migrants to migrate irregularly. So as I mentioned before, Law 69 is the law on contract-based Vietnamese overseas workers that was adopted in 2020 by the National Assembly and implemented in February 2022 of this year. And the key crux of this is that it defines the rights and protections of Vietnamese guest workers who are working under contracts abroad. And it also regulates recruitment agencies so that they are more transparent with their recruitment process and they don't overcharge excessive fees, and they are held responsible for the workers who they're recruiting. There are also several provisions within the law to prevent human trafficking. The first of which is it regulates what they say service fees or brokerage contracts, but really it's like the broker's fees that the workers have to pay in order to be recruited abroad. This is particularly important because it saves migrants a lot of money, because oftentimes they have to borrow an excessive amount, which in order to pay for the fees, which leaves them in a massive amount of debt. So for example, in 2019, the migrant workers who were traveling to Taiwan, this is before the law was enacted, had cumulatively paid over 81 million US dollars to recruitment agencies for the broker's fees. So that amounts to about 1,500 US dollars per migrant worker. And this amount of money would be saved under the new Law 69. There is also a stipulation for that allows contract-based workers to break their contracts if in the event of forced labor, of sexual harassment, or abuse of any kind. So it will allow them to unilaterally break the contracts, whereas before they would have to have the agreements of the employer as well. And there are also provisions to have pre-departure training for the workers before they leave Vietnam. So the pre-departure training must include information on forced labor, human trafficking prevention, gender equality, sexual abuse, gender-based violence, and gender-based violence and prevention skills. And there are also provisions for punishments for recruitment agencies that break the law. So on the Molisa website, they do tend to publish the names of the recruitment agencies that have had their licenses revoked. So this makes it more transparent for job seekers. So one of the case studies that I wanted to highlight is the case of Vietnamese migrant workers in Serbia. So in, I believe, November of 2021, it was discovered that 500 Vietnamese migrant workers were living and working under inhumane conditions for a Chinese tire factory in Serbia. So what had happened here was that these workers were recruited by over 7 different Vietnamese recruitment agencies that were based in Vietnam, that were recruiting for the recruitment agency that's based in Serbia and for the Chinese factory in Serbia. So each worker was charged between $2,200 to $4,000 US. And you can see the picture that is labeled HT group. They would take the passports of the migrant worker, get the visa for them though after they had signed the contract, and they would post it on social media containing all the identifying information. And once the workers got to Serbia, their passports were then taken by their Chinese bosses. And there are, and so with that kind of cost, the workers took on the debt to get the work contract to go to Serbia, because realistically, it is still cheaper than paying $20,000 to get to Germany, for example. And there are indicators of human trafficking and forced labor, where they had withheld their wages withheld, they were not being paid what they were promised, their contracts were unclear. One of the contracts that we had looked at, the English version was slightly different from the Vietnamese version. The Vietnamese version said that they would be paid $1,000 US, and the English contract said that they would be paid in such and such amounts in the Serbian currency, which when we did the conversion, it was about $700 US. It was also unclear what their salary would be, because they were promised that they would make $1,000 US per month, but in reality, they were only paid for the amounts of work that they did per day. So if they only worked 4 days a week, they would only be paid for those 4 days and not the 3 remaining days that they were still in Serbia. The workers signed contracts that were between 1 to 2 years, but the visas they were given only lasted between 3 to 6 months. And this ties into the role and complicity of the Serbian government entities, because they had granted China a special economic zone, which is where this Chinese tire factory was located, so that the Chinese factories were operating under Chinese law rather than Serbian laws. The workers were living in unsanitary living conditions. They lacked clean water, they had dirty bathrooms. In some cases, there were only 2 bathrooms for hundreds of workers to share. They were sharing the same living spaces. This is still during COVID, so when one person caught COVID, the entire room caught COVID, and they lacked, there was a lack of vaccination that was available during that time, and there was also a lack of medicine to treat them while they were sick. They had to pay for personal protective equipment themselves, even though they were working. They were doing hard labor, not hard, but manual labor. And they were working outside in 0 degrees Celsius weather. And workers themselves were unclear if they had proper work visas or if they were given residence permits or the type of visa that they had. And you can see on the right side of your screen, it's another screenshot that we took on Facebook from another recruitment agency where they were advertising that you can work in Serbia for a Serbian boss. You can see that they emphasize or a European boss this time. The flight would be fast. The base salary is $850. It's implied that it's US dollars, and the boss will cover accommodations, and it includes like the fees, which is still a lot lower than what the others were paying. $1,700 plus an $800 deposit, and that's a fee to prevent people from running away. So that's the fee that the agency would keep if the workers abscond. I think I might be running out of time, so I'll go through this part a little bit quickly. Just going back to the Serbia part a little bit, we were able to speak with 2 of the workers, and we were able to kind of coach them through the kind of steps that they would be able to take in order and the options that they had available to them. So both workers actually decided to fly back to Vietnam within the past couple of months. And in Serbia, we were partnering with a local NGO called Astra to help provide support for the remaining workers. And with Saudi Arabia, in general, there are 20,000 Vietnamese migrant workers who are currently in Saudi Arabia. And this is a figure from 2018, and 7,000 of them are domestic workers and are women. And in 2014, Vietnam had signed a 5-year labor pact between themselves and Saudi Arabia to send migrant workers abroad. And there are many accounts of labor exploitation under the kafala system. The indicators include having their passports confiscated, mistreatments and being overworked by the employers, being abused and assaulted by the employers. And there is a very heavy fine to leave the employment contract. So this basically binds the worker with the current employer. And in this particular case, the employer had to agree to let the worker go in order for the worker to be free to find employment elsewhere. And recruitment was done by the Vietnamese labor broker companies. I want to show a quick clip where the Vietnamese domestic workers in Saudi Arabia were speaking about their experience.
At the end of the contract, the owner did not buy a ticket to return home. We have worked for many months. The owner did not pay. We were abused by the owner. The owner took us out here, did not return our luggage, passport, pay our salary. We have only the clothes on our body. Some sisters have stayed at the refugee camp for nearly a year. Some stayed for a few months. Some fell ill. Due to difficult circumstances, we had to come here to work as domestic workers, leaving our young children and elderly parents at home. Now, I am writing this application, on behalf of all the sisters who are stuck in the refugee camp in Riyadh, to the Vietnamese government and the embassy working in Saudi Arabia to consider and help us to return back to our family.
So as you can see, there is a lot of, there's a lot of difficult cases that we try to help, and we try to inform migrants who want to seek work abroad in order for them to protect themselves. So this leads me to speak a little bit about the work that Pacific Link Foundation does. We are a US-based non-governmental organization with over 20 years of experience in empowering women and youth. Our 2 main portfolios are education and modern slavery prevention. And we primarily work in trafficking hotspots across Vietnam and also in transit and destination countries globally. With regards to the modern slavery prevention portfolio, it's broken up into 2 sub-portfolios. So we have the supply chain portfolio, where we work with factories and the factory workers and other migrant workers to help equip them with the necessary knowledge and skills to prevent themselves from being trafficked. And we also have our protection and awareness portfolio, where we work with community members, trafficking survivors, at-risk youth, and frontline responders to raise awareness of the dangers of human trafficking, and in particular for the responders to equip them with the knowledge and skills to protect vulnerable migrant workers and victims of trafficking. 2 programs I wanted to highlight, the first of which is our Empower Migrants, or EMI program, where we work directly with the women migrant workers to help transform them into leaders to improve their access to economic opportunity and lower their forced labor risks. So think of it as a training of trainers program, where we train them on certain topics like workforce readiness skills, human trafficking prevention, safe migration, financial literacy, and we build them up so that they can replicate this to their their community members, to their peers, to their family members. And through this program, we also conduct pre-departure trainings as well. We train both the recruitment centers, the government-run recruitment centers, and also job seekers, because we know how important it is for them to recognize the different scenarios that they may encounter to help prevent themselves from falling into situations of forced labor and human trafficking. And finally, we have our capacity building for responders program. And this is the program that I am primarily in charge of. And this is a program we train frontline responders both within Vietnam and in other transit and destination countries to support vulnerable Vietnamese migrants and victims of trafficking. So we have our online and in-person foundational and advanced training sessions to help them build trust with migrants, because there's often that cultural and language barrier. And oftentimes migrants, particularly irregular migrants, are afraid, they're scared for themselves and their families, so they're oftentimes not willing to cooperate initially. We also have a discussion forum, we have good practices meetings to share information, and we also offer consultation and an online support line for frontline responders. When they can encounter a Vietnamese migrant or a potential victim of trafficking, they can contact us and we can help speak with the migrants. And we also have curriculum developments, victim-centered training, and we have developed a resource handbook for frontline responders as well. Apologies for running out of time. Thank you. And I would like to take your questions after John's presentation.
Thank you, Christina. John, feel free to bring up your slides. And just a reminder, if anyone has any questions for the speakers, you can pop them into the chat box and we'll address them at the end. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Christina. Thanks, Phoebe. And hi, everyone. So glad to be here today. So just a little bit about myself. My name is John Vu, Business Operations Manager at Matera Alliance, Inc., a company providing workforce development solutions here in Vietnam to prevent modern slavery. We provide trainings and also workforce development and safe migration mobile app. So we also are very close partners with Pacific Links Foundation. So just a quick slide on the agenda about to highlight what I would like to talk about today. So first off, I'll be sharing some of the global legislation on prevention of modern slavery. I'm sure many of you have heard about some of this global legislation already. Then I will narrow down more into the supply chain situation, even in Vietnam, and especially about the situations of Vietnamese factory workers. I'd like to talk more about Vietnamese worker vulnerabilities to modern slavery situations, talk about brand and supplier responsibility, as well as end with building capacity and types of solutions that can be used to lower these vulnerabilities. So it's here on the slide, you can see a variety of global legislation around the world on prevention of modern slavery, specifically in supply chain. So it's important to remind everyone that these legislations are existing and continuing to be enacted more and more each year. So corporations increasingly need to provide their due diligence and report on activities and measures that they are doing to prevent modern slavery in their supply chains. So legislation on prevention of modern slavery specifically in the supply chain has existed since the early 2010s, starting with California's SB 657. Further legislation has been enacted and has been built on previous ones, such as the UK Modern Slavery Act, and recently with the Netherlands Modern Slavery Law and Germany's Modern Slavery Law, which will be enacted in the near future. So this is a sampling of the global legislation, and there are several others that are not on this slide, such as through Brazil and Italy. And there are more in the pipeline, as I mentioned, that are being proposed. So everyone here can see this trend. And based off this, we see where it's heading. And therefore, it's imperative that brands and the suppliers that they work with get in front and be proactive in their prevention efforts on modern slavery, especially as Vietnam becomes one of the go-to destinations for manufacturing in the world. So as Christina has already shared the profile of Vietnamese migrant workers being recruited abroad, I will zoom in more domestically in Vietnam, the situation, and focus on the supply chain in Vietnam and the Vietnamese factory worker. So as I'm sure you've heard, Vietnam is increasingly becoming the go-to destination for manufacturing in industries such as electronics, apparel, footwear, machinery, and furniture, and others as well. For example, 6,000 garment factory workers in Vietnam, and there are 6,000 garment factories in Vietnam employing about 2.5 million factory workers, many of whom are women, as well as many of whom are migrant workers. Here, the second bullet point, you can see that the US is the #1 market for textile exports, whereas China is the #1 market for imported fabric materials to support these garment factories. In 2021, Vietnam has overtaken China as #1 exporter of wood furniture to the US. These industries such as apparel and footwear are now leading in Vietnam, so it's very important to, if you are exporting and having business operations to these countries abroad, you have to be sure that you are doing your due diligence on this. So I wanted also to share that Vietnam is attractive for its low-cost workforce that is young and growing and skilled, but these factory workers are vulnerable. So in the following slides, I will share more about the vulnerabilities of these factory workers. But as you can see, there are 16 million workers out of 100 million population in Vietnam that are in manufacturing and construction specifically. So a significant amount of the population. So here are some headlines from news articles I just wanted to share to help illustrate the growth of Vietnam as a manufacturing destination, but also how modern slavery vulnerability exists and the need for it to be addressed and prevented. So on the right side, as you can see, there are some headlines. Vietnam's rise as electronics production powerhouse, made in Vietnam wooden products conquer the US market. Vietnamese workers in Japan are falling through the cracks. So on the right side, these headlines illustrate the high demand for labor domestically in Vietnam, as well as the high demand for Vietnam export labor, as Christina had described in her presentation. In the right side of the column, we can see descriptions of the pressures in the recruitment channels. So, desperate for workers, businesses scour remote villages for direct recruitment. Vietnam's exports can be linked to forced labor. So many factories still do not have enough workers, as they are having a shortage of workers since the pandemic and currently now during the aftermath, and are searching even in the far remote villages, as the headline described. And they are often employing the use of third-party recruiters for this. I remember reading recently, the last few weeks, there was an article from Vietnam Express describing how an electronics component manufacturer was relying on 20 labor agencies to help support them find enough workers for their orders. Another recent article, the second article from Sourcing Journal, describes how exports from Vietnam can be linked to forced labor. The third article describes how there are recent labor law violations at some of these factories and labor agencies that are cooperating together to obtain workers without, one, reporting to the authorities, and number two, hiring workers unofficially in order to evade paying of social security benefits, which is required under Vietnam's labor law. And I included the last article to illustrate how workers are struggling to achieve a livable standard of living, as wages have not really been increasing and living costs have continually exploded here in Vietnam and also around the world. So this leads to workers having to rely on things such as excessive overtime, can lead to things such as borrowing money, sometimes from loan sharks, loan schemes, entering into debt bondage, or even also making the decision to migrate further domestically or abroad, increasing their risks to situations of modern slavery. So all of these headlines together illustrate the importance for brands and suppliers to be proactive in monitoring their supply chain and the responsibility to engage in ethical recruiting practices and proactively prevent modern slavery in their supply chain. So next, I'd like to share with you how risks can be present during a worker's recruitment or employment reality and situation. So first, workers are vulnerable when they are, looking for a job, searching for a job, or whether they are in that situation. So they are vulnerable, as Christina already mentioned, as there's a lack of trusted information and a prevalence of job scams online and in the community. They are also vulnerable to being exploited by unscrupulous brokers that are charging illegal recruitment fees, sharing false job information, providing unclear and deceptive contracts, as Christina had already described. The one contract in English, one contract in Vietnamese had different details in there. Additionally, when workers are employed, workers are continuing to be at risk into falling into situations of modern slavery. So on the job, smuggling networks and human traffickers do target workers as they may be in situations of debt due to their situation. They may be struggling with lower salaries. They are enticed by these false job promises that sound too good to be true in reality, especially the ones abroad, but they make that decision anyways. So again, these factories and industrial parks can be targeted by smuggling networks and human trafficking networks that exploit these large concentrations of workers. Additionally, workers are vulnerable around and outside the factory, such as during their living in worker accommodations. Again, these are areas with a lot of migrant workers, factory workers in these situations where struggling to make ends meet. So again, they can be targeted at these areas as well. So here in this slide, I wanted to share about the brand and supplier responsibility. With the increasing amount of regulations on prevention of of modern slavery in the supply chain, Vietnam's growth and position in the global supply chain, and the business need for ethical, sustainable development for long-term profitability and resilience, it's imperative that brands and suppliers and other stakeholders work together to be proactive in preventing modern slavery before it occurs and damages reputation and profitability. So, as I already mentioned some of the risks throughout my slides, I just wanted to lay them out here in a left side column of risks, a right side column of solutions, which you can see. So with recruitment scams, illegal recruitment fees, and unscrupulous recruiters, some solutions include partnering and working with reputable recruiters, but also monitoring their recruitment processes regularly, having a more closer conversation and monitoring the third-party recruiters that you work with. So having those policies in place. The risks include like unclear labor contracts, withholding of salary, or identity documents. So you have to make sure your company and recruiters comply with labor regulations on things such as working hours, salary, social insurance that I have described. With the situation of low workforce knowledge on forced labor, human trafficking, debt bondage, and all of the other manifestations of modern slavery, it is important to be able to organize trainings on these topics. So topics can be included modern slavery prevention, including forced labor and human trafficking, financial literacy, and safe migration best practices. So brands and suppliers can review their existing policies as proactive action, and in order to increase their compliance with global legislation, they can work together to identify where the gaps are and update their policies. Brands can also support the suppliers they are working with by partnering with various NGOs, companies, service providers, or using in-house if they have the capacity. So, for example, policies can be updated in regards to human trafficking and forced labor. You can review the countries if you're a brand that, if you are a brand, you can review the countries that you're operating in and ensure that you and your supplier are complying with the respective legislation on modern slavery, as well as domestic human trafficking. Brands and suppliers can also increase and look to increase the well-being of their workforce. So there are many benefits to this, such as lowering the risk of modern slavery, lowering the vulnerability, but also when companies and suppliers increase workforce well-being, they are able to create a more attractive and ethical and sustainable workplace, which in turn helps lower things such as turnover rate, increases retention, and lowers the cost of recruitment. So very positive benefits that impact the bottom line of the supplier and the brand. So wanted to highlight the solution of training. So training in particular is a very proactive solution that brands and suppliers can look towards to better be in compliance, lower vulnerabilities on modern slavery, and increase workforce well-being. So whether at the factory, at the sourcing offices and global offices, training is important to build awareness and learn and help the workers learn about prevention. So training can help measure knowledge and awareness levels of the workforce before the training occurs, and then afterwards you can evaluate how the training has helped raise that awareness and knowledge level. It can be provided at regular intervals, and brands can support their suppliers by partnering with solution providers, as I mentioned. And then suppliers can benefit by receiving valuable certifications that help them set themselves apart and be more competitive and be more attractive partners for their clients. So in Vietnam, training may be limited and infrequent, but and also suppliers can lack the capacity or adequate support to provide effective training. So so sometimes the reality is that some training is only provided to several members of management teams and may not reach down to the workers. So it's important to think about providing workers trainings for the workers as well. So I'd like to take a moment here to talk about some of the work we do. So we provide Matera Alliance provides fact training, which is a solution for brands and suppliers to proactively increase compliance with international regulations on modern slavery in Vietnam. It stands for Factory Awareness to Counter Trafficking. As you can see on the left column, some of our highlights and achievements, and on the right, some of our on-site factories that we have provided. So as I mentioned, it's important to bring training to the workers themselves. So when we're working with a factory that has 1,000 workers, we're looking to train all 1,000 of them as well in various workshops. So as factories can be difficult training environments, we've designed it to be incentivized and interactive as possible between the training team, between the managers and the workers. So when we see this happens, we see workers start to really pay attention and learn as they see more and more of their peers participating. So thus they're not only learning from the training team, but they're also learning from each other and ultimately better able to retain some of the information and best practices that we share with them that they can help protect themselves, their community, their factory, and their colleagues. I don't think I have time for a video, so I will skip that. I wanted to mention additional types of trainings, additional types of solutions out there, many of them which are digital solutions. There are digital solutions on training and upskilling. There are solutions specifically looking to address ethical recruitment. many different types of solutions that address financial literacy, as I mentioned, and as Christina has mentioned, debt is something that is used to control workers. So having more financial literacy training is imperative to help prevention of that debt bondage from occurring, and also from modern slavery situations. Additionally, there are solutions out there addressing traceability and transparency. So one more slide. Before I wrap up, I wanted to mention a minute about our work in supporting the development of PaxUhu App, which is a worker well-being and safe migration app. It provides micro-learning, insights, and trusted information for workers on topics such as job listings, safe migration, budgeting, financial literacy. So as you can see here on the slide, we have 6 different sections, one for budgeting. We have calculators with various safe migration calculators. For example, a worker can compare the purchasing power of where they live and where they are looking to move to. So that helps them make better decision making. There's on-the-go learning, as we believe it's important to continually learn and better understand these topics that I've mentioned. There is marketplace and up-to-date and relevant news. So that is my presentation, and hopefully we still have some time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John and Christina, for 2 very informative sessions. We do have a few minutes for questions. Apologies, we might run slightly over time. I hope that's okay. I'm just noticing a few questions coming into the chat now. So I will throw these questions out there to the both of you. I know you guys work very closely together, so feel free to kind of jump in as you see fit. The first question, in your view, what is progressing well and what needs to accelerate when it comes to the protection of migrant workers against modern slavery within the context of Vietnam?
Okay, so thanks for your question, Huong. So I think what is progressing well is a lot more people are aware of what human trafficking is, whereas a couple years back, people were seeing community members disappear and they didn't really know why, they didn't understand. So there's a more widespread understanding of what human trafficking is. But I think what really needs to accelerate is holding, and in particular with migrant workers who want to migrate abroad, holding recruitment agencies accountable for making sure that the migrant workers are going under adequate conditions and are being placed in adequate conditions. So making sure that they are not being subjected to withheld wages, for example, they're able to keep their passports and other identification documents, making sure that they are not working so much overtime and that they're being compensated adequately for their the work that they do. And needing to be more transparent with the recruitment process, because oftentimes it can be convoluted and migrants don't really know what's going on, and they may end up having to pay more, especially for the recruitment fees, for example. Because from my understanding, there are certain factories in certain countries that are willing to pay a one-way flight to get the worker from Vietnam to that target country. But oftentimes the migrant worker may not know that, and the recruitment agency could take advantage of this by double charging the migrant worker for the flights that they were already entitled to begin with.
Great, thank you. I have a question that maybe, John, this may be best for you. So it's around facts. So from Lawrence, how long is the regular program project to implement FACT at factories, and do brands typically target 1 or 2 factories at a time with FACT or multiple things?
So it varies, depends on the brand and the factory, right? So for example, if I am working with a new brand, we can consider, say, a pilot factory first, just so we get used to how we work together and see the results and impact before starting to share a larger roster of factories. So say, and as I mentioned, it is also dependent on the factory, right? Some factories here can be 500 workers work 4,000 beyond. So the program, we tailor it. We have set details in and structure for our training, but it can be tailored to the needs of a factory. So for example, a factory with 1,000 workers, we could do that training in a day. This can be done in 2 workshops for the workers, so 500 workers and 500 workers, and 1 workshop for the managers. So 3 workshops in 1 day. But some factories don't have the capacity to have a large area such as a canteen or such as a training area or hallway where we could set up the training for the workers. So, we may have to have smaller groups over multiple days, or some factories are saying like, hey, we want to have 1 workshop for all the workers at the same time. Is this possible? Then depending on our evaluation, we will work with the factory and see if that's possible. A larger training of 4,000 or more factories, we can say training for 1,000 workers a day or 1,500 workers a day. So it really depends on the capacity of the supplier as well. And with the brand, we can do multiple on-site trainings depending on the schedule. And we also have an online training. So if you choose to have the online trainings for the managers or the workers, with online, it can be run consecutively and at the same time.
Great, thank you. I have a couple more questions. I'm conscious that we're running slightly over time. So just a reminder, if anyone does need to drop off, we will be recording this, so you'll be able to catch up after. We'll try to get through just a couple more questions before we close. So we have a question related to the Serbia example. Trying to understand how was the factory held accountable in this case? Does Serbian law or Chinese law apply, considering they were operating in a special economic zone? And does Law 69 offer any kind of protection or avenue for remedy in this type of case?
Yes, thank you for your question, John Keemit. So in that particular case, it was a little bit of political football back and forth because Serbia was saying that the Serbian government had said that they visited the factory, found nothing wrong. The factory themselves said that they were not mistreating their workers, and yet when news broke out of this, they were moving the workers from different place to different place, kind of to escape media attention. And they themselves said, we don't know what's going on. We treat the workers very well. Any problems that there may be, the workers would have to contact the recruitment agencies, and the recruitment agencies then toss it back to the factory. So a lot of it was kind of like back and forth. I'm not too particularly sure about which laws would apply, because the Serbian government themselves said that they didn't find anything wrong with what the factory was doing. And in this particular case, it had happened before Law 69 came into force. But the basic idea of Law 69 would be that the workers would be able to get support from the Vietnamese government. In this case, it would be the Vietnamese embassy in unilaterally dissolving the contract because of such and such conditions. And I believe in this case, because they were recruited by different recruitment agencies, there were a couple of agencies that said it's okay, like since it was just a trial period, it was just a probationary period, you can break the contract because it was within the first 2 months of the contract.
Great, thank you. And maybe to John first, what kind of evidence would you guys generally like to see from a factory to ensure that migrant workers are being taken care of, particularly for companies that are maybe auditing their supply chain or vetting potential new suppliers? What kind of evidence would make you feel comfortable?
So I think if you see, say, proactive training being provided at a factory, I think that is one indicator that migrant workers are being addressed. There are various types of programs that factories may be utilizing. And I think if in general, there is a safe and strong investment in the workplace, For example, even things such as like, I know it's not really directly related to migrant workers, but I've came across a factory that, you know, they do have many women migrant workers in that factory, but not just them. They take care of the women in such a way that they reserve certain areas of the canteen, so the first floor of the canteen, specifically for pregnant women. So that is one type of thing that I would say like, oh, that really stands out. They're taking a lot of initiative to specifically address the situation of workers in the factory.
Great, thank you so much. There's a couple more questions that relate specifically to your guys' program. So I think what I'll do is I'll connect you guys up with the question askers to answer those questions directly. Just conscious of everybody's time on the call and the fact that we have run over. Thank you both so much for very, very informative session. We will make sure that we circulate this recording as well as plenty more information on the great work that you guys are doing and information on how to contact both John and Christina for further insights into their work. So thank you both so much. Thank you everybody on the line. When you close the webinar, a short survey will pop up. It's really, really helpful for us to get your feedback on this session and to help us to plan for future sessions that hopefully will be as informative as today's. So please take a moment to fill out the survey. Apologies for slightly running over, but thank you all for joining and I wish you all a great week ahead.
Thank you, Phoebe, and thank you to the Migrant Club and to everyone for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.